Welcome to the Northpointe Plus podcast. This is episode 72.
72.
All right. Well,
Walter the Refrigerator Perry.
Well done. I can't think of any others. I'm your occasional host, Brent Conlon. With me, as usual, is Pastor Rick Rubel. Welcome, Rick.
Thank you very much. This is my late night radio voice.
Yesterday's service was awesome. Powerful, great, loved it. Everybody that I talked to about it loved it. We got some great questions on it. What would you like to share? Did you have any afterthoughts when you were done that you didn't share?
Some afterthoughts like Afterburner. My mind is in a random place today. The essence of the message, if you didn't listen or you're trying to think back, what was that about? It was all about margin. It's so we're in this series, Always Hustling, talking about kind of the pressure that we feel to always be going, always be gathering more money, always be doing stuff. And so we've talked in the series about giving God first fruits, the very first off the top. Talked about being stewards last week, about that everything we have comes from God and we're just taking care of it for Him. And this message was really designed to in my mind, just thinking about there are a lot of people I know that think, I would love to give more to the church. I would love to give more to God's kingdom, but I can't because I'm just stretched so thin financially. And I just don't have the ability to do it. All my money is going someplace. And so this whole concept about margin that I really wanted to talk about was, how do you build that into your life so that you can do the things that are really most important? So it was all about really having margin so that you can do what the most important things are, both with your time and with your money.
Yeah, and I mean, on a personal level, always hustling, I mean, that could be written for me. And it's an issue. And I'm sure I'm not alone on this.
Yeah.
I'm self-employed. I work a lot. I'm somewhat driven. I have some hobbies that take up time. And so, listening to you talk about prioritizing the things in our life outside of making money.
Yeah.
That are important to us and creating margins for those things. Even things like, well, I started today. I set a couple of alarms for a 10 a.m. prayer, a 2 p.m. prayer, just
nice.
Needing the reminders that I want God incorporated into every facet of my life.
Yeah.
And for me, it's a matter of practice. I have so many ideas that are lost as soon as I get up off the pillow and I just get flying. First of all, if I don't start my day with my routines, that gives me a chance to incorporate those things into my life. But I have to have reminders, as to what my priorities really are in this world, and what I'm doing. Why am I hustling to build that business and to make that money? What is that for? Just for the sake of creating wealth? I mean, there's things I would like to do with that. So
yeah,
I just thought the message was great.
It really does speak to the whole that whole question of when is enough enough. Yeah, and that's true financially. When do you have enough? And it's true too in terms of the kind of things or the amount of things that we try and incorporate into our life. So, like, when have you had enough vacations or enough whatever, enough hobbies, enough whatever? I tell lots of stories about my family and my dad. Dad was. He was a insurance guy. He had an insurance agency, and he was in Ohio, but he was licensed in Florida because one of his guys in Ohio had a home in Florida too, and had a boat there and some cars. So this guy that Dad had his insurance had a Lamborghini, and he had a yacht. And so Dad and I were talking about this guy one time, and he said, that whole question of when is enough, when is enough? He said it never gets answered. He said, I was talking to the guy who had the Lamborghini and the yacht, and he said, Dad said, is it great to have a yacht? And the guy said, well, actually, what happens when you have a yacht is you say, oh, my yacht is 58 feet long. And somebody else says, oh, my yacht's 64 feet long. And so the 58-foot yacht is then no longer enough. You've got to have a 65-foot or a 70-foot yacht. And so it just, you just get in that cycle. And even though that scale for most of us is not something that we can even comprehend, it scales down to us because we think, I really like my house. I think I'd like a bigger house, or I'd like, whatever it is. Doesn't matter.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, we've got some questions.
We have questions.
We've got great questions. I really liked reading these today. First question comes in from Just Curious.
Just Curious. I remember Just Curious. I've met them 2 or 3 times.
Okay. That is margin a biblical principle or a first world principle? How would you teach margin to someone in a third world country? Which, I mean, is that to say that someone in a third world country is so task oriented that they don't make time?
No, I think probably what's behind that question is that in many third world countries, they don't have the sense of always hustling. They do their thing and just kind of go through. Margin's a normal part of their life, and that it really is a great question, because I think we've got another question that'll probably come in a second as well. That in the Middle East, when Jesus was teaching in the first century, there wasn't all the technology. Obviously, there weren't cars, all those kinds of things, and so life was much less energized, probably, in terms of all the pressures of stuff. It was a conversation where people spent time talking, not even like reading the paper, that kind of thing. It was a very interactive, people-oriented culture, and there was this sense of margin in everybody's life that was just a part of the way the culture worked. I in answer to the question, I do think that it is a biblical concept, because I think the concept of Sabbath, the importance of God modeling Sabbath and then commanding Sabbath for us in terms of taking rest, that was critical. I think the Leviticus 19 passage about harvest that I talked about leaving the stuff that falls and not farming all the way to the edge, that's a concept of margin that gets lived out in terms of God's teaching. In the Old Testament, when you go through not just the Sabbath, but the 7th year, they didn't plant crops. And the year of Jubilee, the 49th year, they had an extra party where they didn't plant stuff. And so there was always this sense of margin that I hope I communicated okay yesterday, that part of what margin does is it helps us live out our trust in God. It's like, rather than trying to do everything we can to eke out every minute of the day, every penny that we have and use it for something, that the concept of margin says, you know what? God's in charge of this, and I don't need to freak out about all that stuff. I can trust Him to provide for me, and I can live without all that pressure of trying to get all that stuff done, or to the pressure to have all that money to be able to do things like everybody else. So in terms of, I think the other part of the question is, how would you teach it to somebody in a third world concept? I don't know that you'd have to do that, because if you think about, I don't hear about it as much, but in Hispanic culture, in Central American culture, the whole concept of siesta, that you work in the morning, and then in the middle of the day when it's so hot, you go home and take a nap. That's margin. You have margin. As a businessman, you would say, oh, no, you can't do that. You've got 2 hours there in the middle of the day that you could be hustling, that you could be working. You've got to maximize that. And that particular culture says, no, the most productive thing that you can do is go home and take a nap. And they survive just fine.
A follow-up question. Just, you mentioned Sabbath. So, and of course, this is going to show my knowledge on some of these subjects, but I just had a discussion about Sabbath yesterday. As I'm trying to avoid tasking on a Sunday. I mean, honestly, what is asked of us on Sabbath? I mean, I'm not expected to just sit around on the couch all day on a Sunday and do nothing, am I? Is that what people do on the Sabbath?
There's a message we preached on Sabbath a while ago. I'm trying to think, because you listen to back sermons probably as much as anybody I know. We talked about it some at that point. I think Sabbath is it really is creating space and break where we can hear from God, where our bodies can rest, our minds can rest. And I think that can look a little bit differently for different people. So 100, 150 years ago, the model that was there, and when I was young, even though it wasn't 100 or 150 years ago, there really was a concept that all the stores were closed on Sundays. And it was one of those things that it was like, oh no, don't go to a restaurant on Sunday, because you make those people have to go to work, and they should be able to have a day of rest. Well, that's long gone. Everything's open on Sunday. I think there is some sense of something really healthy that comes when we just kind of shut down, and that looks differently. At different times for me, sometimes a part of Sabbath rest for me is to work a puzzle, because I can do it. It's mindless. I'm just trying to figure out where the pieces fit, and it really is just this chance to relax. Some other times, Sabbath for me is cutting wood, which some people would say, oh, that's incredible work, because your body gets tired, all that kind of stuff. Well, yeah, but I don't do physical labor in the way that you do with your job. And so because I'm oftentimes sitting or talking or at the computer, that kind of thing, for me to cut wood is like refreshing.
Therapeutic.
There is a sense of being outside when I'm doing that, and just it's an opportunity for me to talk, pray with God, even as I cut, and to sometimes see His hand save me from hurting myself. So yeah, I don't know if that helps. It really is about just taking some time to shut down and let God restore us.
Mm-hmm. All right, I appreciate that. All right, question number 2. Is it possible that instead of Jesus building flex time into his schedule for the unexpected, that he actually planned time for those specific things? Or perhaps he knew something was going to happen that he needed the extra time for, even if he didn't know specifically that a man named Jairus would need his help?
I think the answer to that question is yes. Yeah, yes to both. Did Jesus know that was going to happen? I think that's entirely possible, that he knew what was going to go down with his day. I think when you read that account from Luke chapter 8, and he didn't know ahead of time necessarily that the woman with the blood disease was going to touch him. I don't know that he woke up and he thought, oh, there's this guy named Jairus that's going to come talk to me. His daughter is sick. She's going to die. I'm going to heal. I don't think he had that kind of sense. I do think, the reason why I incorporated those examples into Scripture is because Jesus could have been very task-oriented in terms of, okay, I've got this curriculum I've got to do with the disciples. I've got to get through this teaching with them to make sure that they understand this. I've got to go make contact in this particular town or this particular town because God ultimately is going to use that to reach those towns for eternity. He could have had that task orientation, and Jesus didn't. Jesus, it could have been that he said, I'm not really sure what's going to happen today, but I'm going to trust that God leads through that process. What I wanted to really just point out was that there's this guy who came, and Jesus could have said, nope, I've got other things going. I'm not going to your house. But he had enough margin in his life that he was able to say, yeah, that's the right thing to do. And the point of that relative to the message is, for us, so much of the time we are so scheduled that we think, oh, no, I can't. I'd like to go to Jairus' house, but I can't because I'm supposed to be at this party, or I'm supposed to do this, or I'm supposed to do that, or I've got this that I got to get done for work, so I can't do those things. And I think the challenge for us is to have our schedule with enough flexibility and fluidity that we can see where God is working and we can join him there. We have the ability to say, yeah, I think I'm going to do that. That I think God's in that, and respond positively to it.
Yeah, that makes sense. All right, third question.
You look very thoughtful in this. You don't look very thoughtful any other time, but
I will ignore that. As you're answering that question, I think of times that my adult kids ask me to help them with something, and the amount of times that I've had to say, I don't have time for that.
Yeah.
And, those are the things that stick in my mind. You immediately know, well, that's unfortunate. I wish I wasn't in this position. Or could I do something here that I could change this up so that I could go help? I want to help my kids as much as I can, but
right.
So yeah, that, like I said, the message was impactful yesterday. And I've thought about it since yesterday,
and it really is. When you take a step back, it's not just about being able to do it in the moment. In order to be able to do it in the moment, you've got to think with a bigger perspective to say, how can I run my business? How can I live my life? How can I do what I do in such a way that I can still do my ministry stuff, but create some time that I can go see my kids, that I can spend time with my grandkids.
Yeah.
And that's that whole concept of how do you create that margin? How do you create margin in your life so that you can do what's most important? And that's the challenge. Yeah.
Yeah. Third question. This is a funny one. From Need a Kid.
Need a kid.
With a question mark.
Not a need a kid, but
no. Do you need a kid?
Got it.
Which I know you don't.
You can never have too many kids.
That's probably true. So they say, I have small kids. They are pretty anti-margin when it comes to time, money, and energy. Is margin seasonal?
That's a great question. And I think that the answer to that also is yes. There is a seasonal sense to this. That like if you have margin, if you how do I want to say this? If margin if margin becomes a regulation in your life, it's no longer margin. If that makes any sense, it's a principle. It's not a legalistic burden. How's that? And so with kids, how do you build margin into your life as a mom or a dad? And I think part of that is recognizing that there are things that we can say no to that allow us to have margin with our kids. If your child wants to be involved in every activity and you're going from practice to rehearsal to activity to birthday parties to whatever it is, you've got no margin and you're being a parent. But as a parent, you do have the ability to say, no, we're not going to do that. No, we're not. It's practice your response was part of the message yesterday. No, we're not going to do that. Mm-hmm. And that creates the ability for your child to not have such a structured life that it creates a burden for them and that they live with no margin. Kids, we have 6 kids, and having kids creates an impact on your finances that oftentimes reduces margin a lot. But I think that there are ways that you can figure out how do we live on less so that we still have margin, even though we don't have hardly any money, even if that margin is just a small amount. Or how do we live that out in such a way to say, you know what, we can't take these people who are hurting out to eat, but you know what, we can have them over to our house and have grilled cheese. We've got enough bread and cheese that we can have them for grilled cheese. And to know that God can work through that, that's the margin that you have. You have, an extra loaf of bread and some extra Velveeta or whatever. So, yeah. I think it's all about at whatever stage of life you're at. Like for me right now, we have 6 kids. They're all grown. They're all out of the house. And our grandkids live a long way away. And so it's easy for me to have a lot more margin than when the kids were home and there were a lot more responsibilities relative to investing in them, helping them work through stuff. So it is seasonal in that. But even in that, we can choose what we say yes to and what we say no to so that we still have margin in our lives.
Yeah, and I for myself, like I come into my busy season here soon, and even if it's not a time thing, it's the idea of how my mind is occupied.
Right.
I can create time. When you work for yourself, you can create time wherever you want to, but is my mind available to the people in my life who need me, or am I constantly focused on the next task at hand, even when I'm not working on it? So, it's something that I have to practice.
Yeah. And for you with your own business, having margin, it may even go back to when's enough. To be able to say as a businessman, we could schedule 30 jobs a week and we can get 30 jobs done a week. But we're not going to do that. We're going to choose to only schedule 24 jobs because we can live on 24. We'll make more money. One of the things I think that's happened with COVID that's really interesting, because it's one of my favorite restaurants that changed their schedule from being open, every day of the week from 11 in the morning till 10 o'clock at night and longer hours on weekends, that don't do that anymore because they found out in COVID they don't have to do that. And they made choices that have now created margin, whether that's because they didn't have employees or whatever, but they have a lot more margin now because they're shut down on Sundays and Mondays.
Right.
And they created that sense of margin and Sabbath that's there.
Right. All right, moving along. I like this question. Number 4, how can we keep margin from becoming an idol?
That's a great question. And I think it speaks to the concept of margin is a tool. It's not a law. It's not a burden. It's not something that should weigh on everybody. It really is a tool to say, how is it that I can do what's most important? How is it that I can live in a way that honors God? How is it that I can see where God's working and join Him and have the ability to do that? And margin's a tool that helps create that. Sometimes it might be easy to say, oh, I've got to have margin, when in reality that really means I'm lazy and don't want to work. That's not the goal. The goal, the margin is the tool to help us deepen our relationship with God and be used by Him for stuff that really matters. And so that's true across the board. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Yeah, that makes sense. Question number 5. We're moving along.
Yeah.
We have 8 of them here. Can you provide clarity to creating margin in your life in order to use your time in different ways? It just sounds like a circle of saying no to some things so that you can say yes to other things, but you still end up being just as busy.
Okay, so the heart of the question, if I understand it, is if margin becomes kind of the goal, and so it's, well, let me just kind of go back and just make sure that I stay on track with the question. Mm-hmm. I just said a little bit ago, margin's a tool to help us do the things that are the most important. And so if we say no to things, the goal is that we're saying no to things that don't really matter all that much. They might be good things, but they're not the best things. They may be neutral things, but they take up a ton of time. And to say no to those things so that we can say yes to things that really matter. I would say it's not even a matter of being just as busy. I think when we do things that really matter to us, that matter for eternity, that matter, that are part of who we are, it doesn't feel like the schedule is so full. So so for me, I'm an extrovert. I enjoy being with people. I enjoy doing stuff with people. If I have an opportunity to talk to somebody about Jesus and how Jesus is working in their life, that is life-giving to me. So that's not something on my to-do list that I just check off and think, okay, that one's done. There's not any sense of that at all. I would much rather do that than map out SMART goals for the next 3 years or whatever. Both may take the same amount of time, but they have a completely different impact, because in my value system, the ability to minister is so much more important and brings me a sense of fulfillment that's even greater. So it's not about the amount of time. I would say it's about what you do with that time.
Yeah, how you're feeling.
How you're feeling about it, and if there really is this sense, if there really is this sense that we see, oh, God's in this, and I can join Him in that. That's a completely different thing of, oh, God wants me to do this, so I have to do it. That's a completely different concept. Or I have to do this because it's on my to-do list, or whatever it is. It's when we say the things that we want to say no to that we need to say no to are the things that they're filling time that 10 years from now are not really going to matter. That, it's just not going to matter. And so, yeah, I could talk for a long time about that, because I think there are lots of things that we do that really don't have much eternal significance at all.
Sure. Yeah, just making time for, well, like we said before, time with God, right. Time in study, time. For me, I like to exercise. I know you do too. That doesn't feel busy to me. No. That feels refreshing. That feels like it's good for my soul.
Yep.
Time with my kids, time spent cooking, that's been a much higher priority for me in the last year, is spending more time in the kitchen, and it takes time to do that.
Yeah.
But it's enjoyable.
Yeah. And again, I said at the end of the message yesterday, I felt like in prepping the message, it becomes easy to talk about margin in time, but there's a really strong application, I think, in terms of margin with our finances too. It's really easy to have our money go to things that don't really matter. They don't really matter. And so we don't end up with any margin. And so that's one of those things that, if we can say no, if we can say no to lots of expenditures and instead say yes to giving money to the kingdom for things that do matter, for helping reach lost people, for whatever that is, it may still be the exact same amount of expenditure, but it's going towards stuff that matters and that reflects the heart of God, and that allows us to be partners with Him in the work that He's doing, here and around the world. That's a completely different thing than just spending everything that we have for stuff that's going to end up in someone else's garage sale when we're gone.
Sure. And that's, for me, again, it's practice.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that because this is something I'm great at. It's a constant effort that I have to make. Repetition, practice, being aware of the things that I have put on my priorities, and working towards asking for God's help to live that out. Which I can't just ask for God's help and expect that's going to happen. Then I have to put in the work. It's practice.
You've got to make the decision. So, you're talking about exercise, and so we'll talk about racquetball. My friend. I have an expensive racquetball racket because I love to play racquetball. Some of you will die because I'll just say, when I bought it, it was probably $160 or $180 for a racquetball racket, which is crazy. But the racquetball racket that I have, I probably bought 8 years ago, maybe longer ago than that. And because of the volume of racquetball I play, it would be really easy to justify, I need a new racket.
Mm-hmm.
I'm playing all the time. The technology is better. The rackets are better. It would make a ton of sense to get a new racket. Well, yeah, it would. But I don't need a new racket. It's, what difference is it going to make? 2 or 3 points a game? And I'm playing for exercise. It's not like I'm playing to go be, in tournaments and all that kind of stuff. And so that's a choice to not buy a new racket that creates margin in our finances, because we're saying no to that so we can say yes to other things that matter more.
Yeah. All right. Question number 6. How can someone margin their finances when they don't make enough to cover their necessities? Adding a side hustle would probably make them unable to margin their time. That's a tough spot.
That's a great question, and I think that there is an answer to that does speak to the seasonal nature of things. I think there are times that you recognize that in this season, I'm going to have less margin, but I'm going to have less margin so that I can have more margin in the future at some point in time, and so that makes sense. I would say, oftentimes we look at our financial situation and we say, oh, I don't have any margin. The only way I'm going to get more margin is to make more money. The only way to make more money is I'm going to have to spend more time to do that kind of thing. And as Americans, we don't very often say, no, I'm going to live on less.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to eliminate some of the things that have caused that crisis in my life where there is no margin and you're underwater. What am I going to do about that? And that really is I think I used the word yesterday, ruthless.
Humbling.
That we've got to take inventory and be ruthless about that, about what really matters, and then make choices that will make us different from the world when we say, you know what, I'm okay driving a 15-year-old car, 17-year-old car. It gets me where I need to go, and it does the job, and that's good, and I'm okay with that, as opposed to spending lots and lots of money for a much newer car. It's okay to say, I had this in my notes and it didn't make it into the message. You know what? If the bank says that you can afford 40% of your income for a house payment, that doesn't mean that you have to spend 40% of your income for a house payment. It may mean, in this whole concept of margin, you know what? We can live in this house. It's going to be a little bit smaller than we'd really like, but it's going to function just fine, and that's going to only be 22% of our income or whatever it is. Figuring out a way to say, how is it that the way that I spend my money, how does that reflect the priority that God has in my life, so that I have margin to be able to do wherever God leads me in that. If I talk about the finances stuff, and this this didn't make it into the message, but it's a concept that's really worth talking about. So I'm a big believer in budgeting. That you have to have a budget. You have to know where every dollar is going to go. Dave Ramsey, Financial Peace, good stuff. Lots of tools there to help you figure out how to dig out from underneath, so that Ramsey's line, live like nobody else, so that you can live like nobody else. Mm-hmm. Which means that people are gonna say, no, go to this restaurant, go on this vacation, and you just say, no, I can't do that. And at some point in time, you can. Big believer in budget. And so we did an envelope system in budgeting, where we would budget for different items, and I would cash my paycheck and put cash in each envelope. This was back before days of personal computers even. And we would physically, whatever was in the envelope, that's what we'd spend at the grocery. Whatever was in the eat out envelope, that's what we did. And sometimes it meant that we didn't eat out for 2 or 3 weeks until there was enough money in the eat out envelope that we could go eat out. That process figuring out where your money's going to go is really critical. I'm an advocate to say, give to God first. Give of your first fruits. I say unashamedly, I think that there's tremendous benefit in tithing, in giving 10% to God right off the top. We budget as well money for to be able to give to extra things, so that I'm not living on as tight a budget now because God's blessed us in a way that we have flexibility to do stuff. But when we were living on a really tight budget, we would budget money to be able to give to special needs that were on top of what we gave to the church. So, there at some point in time, there might be $150, $200, $250 there that was available to say, somebody had a need and say, oh yeah, we don't have any money, but we've got $150 that we want to give towards that need because we had planned for it ahead of time. It was a priority for us to do that. What I couldn't really fit into the message and communicate on a wide scale was, I think that both of those things need to be a part of your budget, and you need to have margin on top of that, because margin on top of that allows you to live and say, yeah, no pressure. No pressure about the finances. We don't need to worry. God's going to provide for us. We've got everything planned out. We've trusted Him through that process, and we've got a little bit extra. That's it's margin creates a sense of freedom that even if you're living on a really strict budget, and you've got every penny budgeted, there still is a sense of constraint that, while there is freedom in that, there's sometimes, for me, the pressure in that. And to have just a little bit extra, that I knew, if we go over a little bit, it's okay because we've got margin to be able to cover it. We built in margin into our budget on top of all the things that we budgeted, just in case. And that was different than emergency fund. That was different than savings. It was different than all those things.
Excellent. Next question for you, Rick, comes from Abby.
Hey, Abby.
The message on margin focused mostly on finances and time. You briefly mentioned emotional and physical margin. What other aspects of self, our lives, do we need to consider as we audit ourselves and determine areas that we need to incorporate margin?
Yeah, I don't know that I have a great answer for all. Like, I at one point, and when I was prepping the message, I thought, oh, do we talk about all that stuff? Do I need to start thinking through what all those things are? And I just decided I wasn't going to go there. I do know that that I think that we need to have emotional margin, a margin in our emotional lives. That if we're living with stress all the time, if we're living if our relationship with our family or our spouse, whoever it is, if there's a tension that's there all the time, we've got to figure out ways to just breathe and relax some, and allow God to breathe new life into those areas. So I think that there's an emotional aspect to that. I think that there's, again, margin it's a principle, not a burden. And so I think that there's, I think that when we live with margin, we live with the ability to respond to however God leads. So if you're somebody who has like, a 15-minute or a 30-minute quiet time, there's something healthy in building some margin to say, you know what? Yeah, I allocate 30 minutes, but I'm going to spend 35 minutes today with God. And you have the margin in your life to be able to do that because of how God's leading through that process or whatever. So I think there's a spiritual aspect. I think there's an emotional aspect. I think that there's a compassion. I think I talked about that in the context of the parable of the Good Samaritan, that it's easy to come down really hard on the priest and the Levite who walk by, but I think whether they didn't have margin in their time or they didn't have margin in their emotions, in their spirit, to have compassion on the guy, the Samaritan did. he responded. And sometimes we don't cultivate a margin in that aspect of our life too, and we just need to do that, which means that you've got to replenish and have joy and beauty and stuff so that you can do those things as well. And sometimes that means having boundaries. You can say that you need to say no to relationships that are toxic or that are painful or whatever, so that you have the margin to be able to say yes to relationships that God leads you to, that He's working through that process.
Yeah, I was thinking about the messages that we allow in as well, not just but where we're receiving, what we're looking at, what we're receiving information from, which I think we're called for that as Christians anyways.
Right.
To have a different view on that. Last question is from Dan. I'm going to butcher this.
Hermitlou.
Thank you.
Yeah. Hi, Dan.
I'm interested what you think about this. Is creating generational wealth compatible with an authentic Christian worldview? Does that idea fit with your ideas about giving first fruits, creating margin, being committed to the mission of Jesus?
Does
being driven to create real wealth, is that anti-Christian? Is that what he's saying?
I think that's what he's asking, and there's a whole lot of pieces to that. There's probably a sermon series on that in there somewhere. The Scripture doesn't teach against wealth, but Jesus said it's harder for a rich man to go through the eye of a needle than to enter the kingdom of heaven. So there are some. It's hard. Did I say that right? It's harder for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven than it is for a camel to go through the eye of a needle. And we could unpack that because there's a whole bunch of stuff that's been written about that. So I think that there are some very clear warnings in Scripture about wealth. I think if you go back to what Jesus said when He said, "Where your heart is, that's where your treasure's going to be." No, where your treasure is, that's where your heart going to be. We flip it around and do it the way I did it first. Where your treasure is, that's where your heart is. If your finances are all about you, that's a reflection of your heart. If you've got a lot of resources, but you're pouring them into kingdom, into things that matter, that reflects where your heart is. In Proverbs, it talks about the benefit and the blessing that comes from being able to give an inheritance to your children and your children's children. And so there is generational wealth in that sense, but I think it all comes from the perspective of recognizing everything that we have comes from God. It's not ours. We're just stewards of it. And I think being a steward of it can impact what we're able to bless our future generations with and how we live that out. So if I talk about that, again, just from a real personal standpoint, I've said before in lots of messages, there were times that with the size of our family and that kind of stuff, we didn't have any money at all that we could do hardly anything with. Well, my parents have both died. Deb's parents have died, and we received inheritances from them that have allowed us much greater flexibility. I would much rather my parents be alive than to have the money. Same thing, obviously, with Deb, but one of the things that's happened through that is my mom and dad's influence on us in particular have allowed us to take what has been given to us and to hold it with wide open hands and to be able to say, how is it that we can use this for stuff that matters? And part of that is involved in helping out our kids, but also helping them work through the process of depending on God for their needs too. So, what was the last half of that question? I do think that there is a pursuing wealth for the sake of wealth. That's not a great concept biblically. I think pursuing wealth so that you can impact the kingdom, I think that's a great thing. It's all about the why. And like we've got a friend that they would say their spiritual gift is making money, and they do, and they give lots and lots and lots of it away, because it's anything they touch, they make money, and that's a cool thing. But they don't hold it tightly. It's not
hoarding. It is what we're supposed to be afraid of.
Right.
Or not afraid of, but
just that we're not supposed to do, that we don't get consumed with that.
And I imagine for a lot of people, I mean, especially if you came from not much and you start actually making real money, the idea of protecting that, setting your kids up so that they don't have to worry about finances. I mean, I could see where a person's trying to live as a good Christian and is still trying to hoard money at the same time, trying to make sure that they and their kids never have to deal with that financial stress that they've been through before.
But what's interesting, what you just described, it's all about them as opposed to their dependence on God. I think I've told this story before, but a formative thing for me was, I remember when I was, I must have been in college. I think maybe as a young adult, and we were with mom and dad, and one of my siblings was in a really bad place financially. Some stuff had happened, and they were really hurting for money. And mom and dad had the ability to alleviate that need. They had helped them multiple times before, and this was not this particular situation. My sibling was doing kingdom stuff, and they just weren't. They didn't have any money, and they had expenses for medical stuff. I can't remember what it was. And mom and dad were telling us about this need. And mom said, I talked to your dad, and we're not going to help them. We're not going to give anything to help them, because they need to know that God is the one who takes care of them and provides, and not mom and dad. And I thought, that's hard. That's hard to say, mom and dad, you could take care of this. You could take away all this anxiety, and them say, no, God's the one who takes care of that. And you can trust him to do that. And God did. And the mom said, I can remember mom saying, when they see the money come from someplace that they don't expect, they will know that it's from God. And it did. And they did. And it was really cool. We tend to think, oh no, I've got to be the solution for our kids, for whatever it is. And it's much more important that we teach them about stuff that matters for eternity.
Sure. Excellent. Well,
I think we can finish there.
Yeah, that's what we've got. Appreciate it. You have anything else? Any other final thoughts you want to add? How long is this series?
1 more week. We a special guest this coming week, Doug Rutledge from Crossroads Farm is coming to speak and talking about generosities, which really jazzed about. If you're watching this week, make sure you're here Sunday. It'll be the last Sunday with Chris on staff, and so we'll do a special prayer time with him, and that'll be cool too.
Excellent. Yeah. Well, this is episode 72. Thank you for joining us this week.
Signing off.